I just want to say and discuss this issue of civilization and the tendency towards what I call decivilization from a slightly personal point of view. So there were two things in my life. I'm a very old guy. I've just turned 77, but I could even be older, I'm not really sure. And there were two things in my life that changed me. The one was in 1956 in the Hungarian Revolution, which really made me realize the possibilities that freedom represented, where ordinary people could take their matters into their own hands and try to change their world. And that has inspired me. Every time I feel like committing suicide and looking in the mirror and say, why is the world so horrible? I think back of October 1956, and it kind of gives me the inspiration to carry on. And the second thing that changed my life, paradoxically, is its very opposite, is October the 7th. And the thing that really upset me about October the 7th wasn't what you saw. It wasn't the horrible massacre of people, which is something that has, is not unusual, unfortunately, in the world, happens now and again. The thing that really horrified me about October the 7th was the reaction to it. Because I thought in many ways the reaction to October the 7th by our cultural elites, by the cultural institutions of the Western world, by the universities, by the left, by academia, the reaction to it was so cravenly and so cowardly and so anti-civilizational that at first I could not really believe what I heard. And somebody earlier on referred to that famous tweet. And there are many tweets like that where basically a smug academic who doesn't know his ass from his elbow basically said, if you thought decolonization was just writing essays, you're wrong. This is what decolonization really means. And in a very smug, arrogant way, he took what is a massive tragedy, a massacre, the taking away of lives of young people, and for him that was a joke. That was something that he was very casual about. He felt that this was okay. This was teaching these bloody Israelis, these bloody Jews, a lesson. And that kind of reaction, which wasn't simply confined to one or two individuals, actually upset me a little bit. It also upset me when I kind of began to engage with my academic colleagues who all have PhDs. They're all meant to be phenomenally intelligent. They're all meant to be emotionally literate. They're super sensitive. When they see a pussycat, upset, they start crying. What's happening to little pussycat? And they have every woke sentiment that's going. And yet, when this happens, when this horrible massacre occurs, and you see it right in front of their eyes, they kind of switch off. And some of them think this is really cool. They got it coming. This is something that deserves. And for me, when that happens, you realize that actually the people that are supposed to be upholding our civilizational values, supposed to be upholding the ideals that humanity has fought for over the centuries, that whole humanistic instinct, which has always been really very, very important, for these people, those civilizational values were not important when push came to shove. Not only that, but they actually became complicit in what I see as this very dangerous process that we're seeing around us, which is the tendency towards decivilization, whereby all the really crucially important gains, humanistic gains that have occurred over the past, are suddenly rolled back. And I'm not just talking about free speech. I'm not just talking about the right of moral autonomy. I'm not just talking about the way in which the idea of tolerance is now regarded as no longer relevant in most kinds of cases. I'm not just talking about the way that the Enlightenment values are dismissed as the Enlightenment project, and the way in which everything from Greek philosophy onwards is regarded as some way, in some shape or form, complicit in the construction of white supremacy and white privilege. What I'm also talking about are basic norms of human behavior. Because in the first instance, what civilization meant was the creation of a whole set of moral restraints upon the way we behave and engage with each other. Civilizational behavior, being civilized, was very much about the fact that when we disagree, I don't punch you, I don't hit you. Civilization was very much about the fact that we made a moral distinction between ourselves as human beings and animals. There's a moral distance between ourselves. Civilization and civilizational behavior was really about the idea that we kind of have to cultivate ourselves as individuals. You have to cultivate our manners. You have to learn to be civilized. Civilization is not something that happens spontaneously. It's not something that's in nature. It requires human cultivation. It requires that we go out of our way and make that happen. And what we're seeing today is almost like the very opposite, where, for example, a lot of the ideologies that are around the universities suggest that there's something wrong with binary thinking. That somehow a binary, by definition, is something that is morally corrupt, whereas we know that all of human science, human philosophy, and moral thinking is about thinking in a binary way. I'm sorry. There is a world where there is good and there is evil, and there's a world where there is right and there is wrong. If you look at the way in which human thought has evolved, it's been through the civilizational binaries. And all those things are now being put to question. So why is it that there's this revulsion against civilization, against civilized behavior? Why do we think it's really cool to have drag queens indoctrinating 6, 7, 8-year-old children? Why do you think, why is it that young people are being exposed to the kind of behavior that certainly my mother and my father and a whole generation would have thought as being decadent and disgusting? Why is it that we now think that's very cute when you have those kinds of events kind of occurring? Why is it that we can no longer take ourselves sufficiently seriously and say that we actually know what a woman is, and we know what a man is, and we don't need to have a PhD in psychology to make those nuanced distinctions and find different ways of interpreting them? So all those things about civilization and decivilization, I think, are really, really very important to me. So I thought about it. How is it that even the word civilization is now seen in a negative way? If you look at most of the literature that's now published, civilization is almost always framed in a negative manner, especially Western civilization, which is seen as being super and hyper bad and hyper negative. What is it about civilization that we don't like in the Western world? Well, civilization has got two aspects to it. It's got a more or less a neutral or ethnographic aspect to it, where it describes an advanced state of social organization, an advanced state of human cultivation. And it refers to the way in which in some societies those breakthroughs have occurred. But the problem is that even when you describe it in that neutral way, in our world, the very fact that you describe a society as advanced is not allowed. It's somehow seen as being morally wrong, because the very moment you talk about an advanced society, you presuppose that there are societies that are not advanced or even backward. You have societies that are semi-civilized. And of course, what the objection to this is that by definition, the word civilization has got a normative content. The word civilization makes an evaluation both about the civilized and the uncivilized. And in our world, there is nothing worse than making a distinction that somehow suggests that some form of social organizations are superior to others. So we're not allowed to say, for example, I'm not Christian, but most Christians naturally believe that their religion is actually superior to other religions. They think it's more advanced than, let's say, Islam is. And that's the way that they would kind of naturally see the world. People would think that their world, their society is more advanced than other societies. You cannot say that, because that's making a judgment. In the Western world, we are not allowed to make judgment, because judgment is now denounced as judgmentalism. And instead of understanding that making judgments is the only way that we can interpret the world around us, we now live in a world where instead of allowing people to make judgments, we encourage people to become non-judgmental, right? Non-judgmental. And most people in this room, I'm sure in their education in schools, would have been told not to be judgy, that non-judgmentalism is an inherently a positive value, and those people that are judgmental are really old-fashioned conservative idiots who are stuck in the past and cannot really yield to new kinds of experiences. But of course we know that human morality requires us to make judgments between right and wrong, good and evil. I mean, everything to do with moral norms involves the making of a judgment, and so does civilizations. And that is one of the main reasons why civilization has become seen as being so negative, because we can no longer argue that one civilization is advanced, more advanced than another, but not only that, but it's superior to another. On the contrary, we now live in a world where there's a role reversal. And the role reversal is that the more advanced a civilization is, the worse it is, the bigger problem it is, because civilizations are bad for the environment. Civilizations destroy the planet. Civilizations, in a sense, take us away from nature. And you now have this absurd literature that is being pumped out to young people everywhere that basically say that, how could you say that our civilization, Western civilization, is better than those of the people living in the Brazilian rainforest, who are essentially struggling to survive on a day-to-day basis, for whom the idea of cultivating their behavior, of restraining their behavior, of developing a certain insight into the world that transcends their experience does not exist. In fact, people say, and I'm sure you've heard this, that native people in Australia or Native Americans 300 years ago, or all these other people understood much better how to keep the world sustainable. They had all these incredible insights about nature that we, despite our biological, scientific advance, simply do not understand. So the point I'm making is that when we begin to abandon the judgment, which is essential to the civilizational mission, then what we end up is something that is horribly going in the opposite direction. And we are in the middle now of a process of decivilization, where literally everything that has been gained and accomplished is rolled backwards. The final point I want to make is that take the example of the relation between humans and animals. I mean, one of the most important ways that civilization advanced was that human beings made a distinction between their natural animal side and their human side. Today what we're arguing is that actually there is no moral distinction between humans and animals. We're even told that animals can consent to having sex with humans. We're even told that animals have rights that they can somehow kind of live by. And essentially, when we get to the point where we argue that animals can consent, when that's the way we see the world, then what Hamas did on October the 7th makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense because having been demoralized and deprived of the civilizational insight that has been important to humanity, we now live in a world where we see an attack like October the 7th through the eyes of an animal rather than of a human being. Thank you.